Souls games are known for many things: its extraordinary level design, variety of choices on how to approach a game, and of course the difficulty. These topics are all very important and could be talked about for hours, but in this video I want to focus on something smaller, but in my opinion just as important as any other aspect of these games: the opening segment. Souls games are not easy, so it's crucial to invite players into the world and guide them further, explain how the game works and set expectations properly. And FromSoftware's approach is quite unique. Let's start at the beginning with Demon Souls. In 2009, it was a completely new type of a game. Nowadays everyone knows what to expect from Souls series, more or less. We even have a separate subgenre of video games which is referred to as Souls-like. But back then it was a novelty. Players knew that it was a game created by FromSoftware that was mostly known for the Armored Core series. But what to expect from this dark fantasy action RPG? Demon Souls starts in a tutorial area. Right away you see signs on the ground explaining basic controls: how to attack, how to sprint, how to shield and parry incoming attacks, and use healing items. You also encounter some enemies that are relatively easy to beat. Going further ahead you fight slightly harder enemies, but nothing that you can't handle. So far it's the usual tutorial that one would expect from this kind of game. But then you reach the boss. This is where your usual video game should present you with an actual tutorial boss fight. But FromSoftware decides to show you what this game is about. You don't deal much damage to the boss, and it hits you quite hard. If you're playing this game for the first time, it's highly unlikely that you would beat it. And when you die, you don't get a second chance. You are being transported to the Nexus. The story advances with you being defeated by the tutorial boss. And even if you manage to beat Vanguard, what awaits you in the next area is scripted death. This is how the game sets your expectations. It tells you that you will die, and die a lot. It presents to you a sense of defeat. It feels like a normal approach for such kind of games now. FromSoftware even used something similar in Sekiro and Elden Ring years later, but mind you, Demon Souls was the first game of its kind really. And it was a huge risk. This tutorial section could simply push away the player and cause lots of frustration. I actually believe that it might have been one of the reasons why Demon Souls didn't become popular until after Dark Souls became mainstream. Speaking of Dark Souls, its opening segment on the first glance is somewhat similar to the one in Demon Souls, yet it is different in many aspects. Instead of the proper weapon, the only thing you have in your hands is a broken hilt. The first so-called enemies you encounter are just dummy targets. Next you see a bonfire, a save point when you can restore health, something entirely new to the series. And after that, in the next room you find a boss, which you fight with this broken hilt and you deal pretty much no damage. If you played Demon Souls before, you kind of expect that now the boss will kill you and the story will progress. Surely developers wouldn't want you to spend several minutes poking the boss with this joke of a weapon. But when you die, you are transported back. The game tells you that you have to somehow beat this boss. And you start looking for a solution and you find an escape from the boss room. Now you're guided to pick up your shield and weapon. Also you learn about the existence of traps and get a healing item, Estus Flask, which is once again a new thing that wasn't presented in the previous game. And once you approach the fog gate, the note teaches you about plunging attack, as a hint on how to defeat the boss. And when you use this attack, it deals massive damage. In a span of minutes, this opening section presented 3 key mechanics that this game introduced to the series and made it seamlessly. Plunging attack wasn't a thing in Demon Souls, and without this section the player probably wouldn't even know that it exists in Dark Souls. And interestingly, if you defeat Vanguard in Demon's Souls, you will be awarded with some crafting items and additional souls, and if you kill Asylum Demon on your first encounter, usually with black fire bombs that you can choose as a gift, you get Demon's Great Hammer. It's a nice small touch from the developers to acknowledge this achievement of not doing things the intended way. The beginning of Dark Souls 2 feels bizarre if you've played previous games. You start without anything, you don't even get to customize your character until you arrive at the hut a minute later. And the game is less subtle with its intentions. In the cutscenes, you are being told straight away that you are going to fail at some point. I personally prefer the way Demon's Souls introduced it through gameplay, not a scripted narrative. The next section after the bonfire is your proper introduction area, however it works differently now. Tutorials are being hidden behind the fog gate, and if you don't want to do it, you can just skip it. The game expects that you might be a returning player and doesn't force you to replay the tutorial part again. Demon's Souls allows you to skip the journey to the Nexus on subsequent playthroughs, but it does it through a prompt. Here it's integrated into the level. The first two sections are just tutorials, they aren't made as a part of the journey like in Dark Souls. There is no end boss here, just stones with instructions and several enemies. If you skip it, you don't lose anything. The most interesting part is a third fog gate, and if you play Scholar of the First Sin, this entrance is actually blocked by a statue, and you can access this area for a moment. You would need to get a special item and return later. However, in the vanilla version, there is no statue. You can access this part of the game right away, fight some archers and encounter a duo of mini-bosses. They are quite strong for you at the moment, but you still have an option to fight them if you want. And that raises the question, what version had it better? On one hand, in vanilla you are free to explore this area right away, and exploration is an important part of any Souls game. In both versions, in the starting area you can go back and find a passage with a mini-boss, and I didn't even know about it the first time I played Dark Souls 2. It's a great design choice as the game awards you for wanting to explore. In Scholar, the statue hints you to come back to this zone later, and it's not something new to the series. In Dark Souls Asylum, there is a blocked way that you can't access until you revisit this area later in the game. I think both approaches are fine, it's just strange to see this change in the updated release. Now let's take a look at Bloodborne. The introductory section in this game is pretty short. When you wake in the hospital, you find similar signs on the ground with basic instructions, and there is only one enemy waiting for you. And as you don't have any weapons, your hits don't deal much damage. Reminds of something, isn't it? If you die to this enemy, the game continues and you find yourself in the Hunter's Dream, just as in Demon's Souls. Though once you get a weapon, you have to return back to the hospital and you can quickly dispose of the monster. But there are other ways to get to Hunter's Dream from the start. The amazing thing is that you can choose not to fight at all and run past this enemy through the door. Also, just as before, you can actually beat this monster either by slapping it until it's dead or staggering it by using a charge attack from behind. I'm actually surprised that there is no sign on the ground hinting to use this mechanic similarly to plunging attack in DS1. And personally, it's disappointing to me that the introduction of new mechanics like this stagger or weapon transformation attack are not made the same way as in the previous games. In Bloodborne, you learn about this stuff from notes within the Hunter Dream, where there are no enemies you can test it on. It might feel like by this point developers expect you to know all basic stuff about their games and just discover the rest on your own. Nevertheless, it doesn't diminish Bloodborne as a fantastic game that is considered by many to be the best one FromSoftware ever created. Dark Souls 3 takes everything implemented in earlier games and combines it to, in my opinion, the best tutorial experience in the franchise. DS3 doesn't really have any new significant mechanics, but it feels like its opening section is carefully crafted to introduce the game to newcomers and at the same time remind basic controls to the veterans of the series. Unlike Demon's Souls and DS1, the progression in the opening area is not linear. On each branch of the path, you learn something from the signs and enemy encounters. One of the paths leads to the sign with a warning telling you to turn back, and it's up to you to follow this advice or ignore it. If you proceed further, you will encounter Crystal Lizard, which would be a pretty challenging fight for the beginning of the game. Just like in DS2, the game encourages you to explore and gives you an opportunity to engage in difficult fights early on. Right from the start, DS3 shows you that this game is all about exploration. And what is really amazing about this design for a tutorial is that it doesn't simply teach you mechanics and what buttons to press, but also rewards you for it. One amazing part is when you read an instruction on how to jump, and if you do it properly, you will land on the top of the stone coffin, where Titanite shard awaits you as a reward for completing this tutorial task successfully. There was a similar moment in DS2, but here it's much more memorable, as you can miss the target and you'd have to redo it again. The game has recognizable practice points for backstab and plunging attack. Everything you need to know is explained here, in the first couple minutes of the game. And then you encounter the boss, whose name I still don't know how to pronounce correctly, and it's the perfect tutorial boss fight. The game doesn't give you any hints or instructions on how to beat it, because you should already know all that. What you've learned on the way to this fight should be enough for you to emerge victorious. It almost feels like a graduating exam, and that's the best way to finish a tutorial. Sekiro Shadows Die Twice is not exactly a Souls game, as pretty much the only common thing it has with previously mentioned titles is the difficulty. Yet I decided to include it either way because its opening segment is worth taking a look at as well. Here, instead of signs on the ground, you get explanations about mechanics through pop-up windows, which might feel less immersive, but it doesn't really matter as they do their job perfectly. You learn how to jump, walk on the edge hugging the wall, you see the prompt about stealth. All this wasn't presented in Souls games, so it's crucial that you know about it. After you get a sword, you fight several enemies in a row and the game explains combat mechanics. It's different from the way DS3 presented you with an easy enemy to test a skill on. Here it's much more active and your opponents are more dangerous. The first area also ends with a boss fight, which you are supposed to lose, just like in Demon's Souls. And once again, even if you manage to beat Genichiro, you are still defeated, though here it's mostly done for narrative purposes. Sekiro is much more story-driven game, with lots of cutscenes and dialogues, so it's expected that the introduction to the game would include story elements, which might hurt the pace, but don't hurt the game itself. And yet, the main idea still works. You get all basic knowledge about the game, and it also continues after this prologue is finished. Despite being a difficult game, Sekiro is extremely player-friendly when it comes to teaching how it works. At this point, the only thing that's left is Elden Ring. Although it's a new IP, it's a Souls game through and through, and the initial area is a throwback to Demon's Souls once again. Here, the very first enemy you encounter is a boss, and not an easy one by any standards. And just as before, even if you kill it, the outcome would be the same, except you are rewarded with a weapon and a shield. It's exact same approach. But that's only the first part of Elden Ring's opening. When you spawn after the first battle, you can either go outside right away or visit Cave of Knowledge, and this is a straight-up tutorial zone. Instead of signs on the ground like in Dark Souls, the tutorial notes are presented the same way as in Sekiro. I personally don't like these pop-ups interrupting gameplay, but it's not a big deal at all, plus you can just disable them in the menu. Cave of Knowledge itself is a linear zone with a number of enemies and a boss at the end. And surprisingly, this boss is extremely easy. It's just slightly more powerful than the enemies you've been fighting a minute before that. And at first I didn't like this simplification, but then I realized that this area is not for me. I've played all Souls games before Elden Ring, so I know what to expect to a certain degree, and this boss doesn't present any challenge whatsoever. But while for me this boss might be a joke, for a new player this would actually be a great taste of fundamental gameplay. Moreover, here you get a taste of victory, the satisfaction of beating your first boss, and it's another great way to introduce the game to a new audience. You leave this area with a certain sense of accomplishment, and once you get outside to the open world, one of the first things you see is Tree Sentinel boss, and you get decimated by this guy, and however experienced with Souls games you are, it still will be a challenging fight. And that's how the game gives you a reality check. If you thought every enemy would be as easy as Soldier of Godric, you are dead wrong. But also nothing stops you from ignoring Tree Sentinel altogether. As in previous examples, the game is about exploration, so skip it, return later, you don't need to kill this boss right now, unless you want to. You have a choice, and it's the most important part of the game design, not to decide for the player how to play, but instead give different options. The freedom on how to approach the game is one of the main things that makes Souls games truly outstanding. It's amazing how FromSoftware improves and changes opening sections over the years and manages to introduce their games to players in a perfect way. The opening in Souls might not be the most memorable part of a game, but it's certainly something that's made masterfully and should be appreciated by anyone who plays and loves video games. I hope you enjoyed this video as much as I've enjoyed making it. Please consider subscribing to the channel, as it would give me a tremendous motivation to make more similar videos in the future. Also, feel free to leave a comment with your thoughts, and as always, thank you for watching and have a great day.